Oh, hey there. So today I'm going to be talking about diagonal grids as opposed to standard grids like the one that I'm reversing creases on right now, and talk a little bit about why I use them, and then go into the details of how to fold them. So a standard grid has grid lines parallel to the edges of the paper, but the diagonal grids have grid lines perpendicular to the edges of the paper. And this might be done to get a nice smooth border. You get a perfect hexagon edge for some patterns. It might be used to align repeats of the pattern with the edge of the paper. So like these three repeats are all pretty closely aligned with that edge. And this is a diagonal grid under the hood, even though it doesn't have that perfect hexagon boundary, because the underlying tiling didn't allow me to have a tiling break aligned with the pattern repeats. This one is at a tiling break, so I have those pleats heading off to the edge of the paper, and it's pretty aligned with the pattern repeats. You can see that the exact alignment would be slightly different, but I chose to do a diagonal grid because I wanted that perfect hexagon outline. And I knew this would be close enough that I could get this far out and not have any of these pleats on this side of the corner of the hexagon. So that's some of the reasons why we use diagonal grids. Another reason is I've been teaching tutorials lately that use diagonal grids, and there's going to be another one next week. So I figured it was time to go into how exactly to fold these grids. This is something that I also teach in Tessellation Foundations, and so a lot of what we do today is going to be review if you've gone through Tessellation Foundations and folded all of those practice pieces in there. But I'm going to show you right now how to fold these diagonal grids on hexagons, both with even divisions and with odd divisions. So let's go ahead and get started. When you see a hexagon, you might think, oh, there's just one way to fold it in half. I'm going to fold from edge to opposite edge. But that's not what we're doing today. Today, we're rotating and folding from point to opposite point. So this point is going up to there. And if you've cut out your hexagons yourself, the least reliable part of the hexagon is the corner. So just wanted to say that up front. The least precise part of a hexagon is the corner. The second least precise part is the edge. What we really want to rely on when we're folding grids are the existing grid lines. So all of my gridding techniques are based on using existing grid lines to get what you want. So I'm going to go ahead and mark where that fold hit the edge on both sides. That'll be important later. And I'll reverse that crease. So flip the paper over and fold the paper the other way, and then come back to the side that I'm folding my grid from. This is something that I always do so that the creases are easy to fold in both directions, and I always return to the same side of the paper to fold the next grid line because it's going to make my grid more consistent, and there is actually a slight visual difference. And if you have your own paper, this will be easier to see with your paper, but you can see ever so slight ridges on this side of the paper that are not present on the other side. Again, very subtle, not super important, but I do like to keep all of my creases folded the same way the first time that they're folded. And so it's a hexagon. We are going to have a grid intersection in the center. We need to do the same fold on the other two directions. So I'll rotate and again bring one corner to the opposite corner. I'm also paying attention to how these corners on the right and left hand sides are lining up, and flatten across. Then I can use my bone folder to really press and get that nice and smooth. You'll notice that I've become ambidextrous when using the bone folder on grids. And I'll go ahead and mark those places where the fold hits the edge before I fold that back the other way. And now we have one direction left. And we will do the same fold, corner to opposite corner, really paying attention to those right and left side corners as well. And fold through. Opening up, I'll mark my points and flip the paper over to reverse the crease before returning to the side where I'm folding my grid. Now, you might notice, and there's a couple different things I wanted to say there. This point is halfway between the corners on that edge of the paper. So this diagonal grid is a special case of an arbitrary rotated grid, so rotated relative to the edges of the hexagon, where you can pick any fraction along that edge and mark the point first. And then you would have 2 points on opposite sides of the center and fold between them by bringing points on one side, 2 points, to 2 points on the other side. Now those you would need to mark the fractions first and then do the folds. The diagonal grid is simpler because you just do the folds and the points come out. Now when I am dividing my grids, I always want to be dividing the line going through the center. So there's 2 different ways to think of divisions on this grid. One way is to say, okay, I'm dividing the space between the point and the opposite point because I folded that in half the first time, therefore I'm going to fold it in half the next time. But what I say is, no, I am dividing the line that goes through the center. And if you bring the point up to the center, then you're not dividing this line evenly. You're dividing it into 1 1/2. So in order to divide this line evenly, I need to bring this corner point up to the center line. And likewise, this corner point, I say corner point, end point of the fold. Those 2 endpoints of the fold are going to come up to the center grid line, which is just the same line in a different direction. Sorry about my head getting in the way there. And I'll do little red ticks for ease of viewing. Can zoom in a bit. And then I will fold all the way through, open up, and I'm going to go ahead and rotate halfway around. So I'm doing the parallel equivalent fold because we'll be doing the same fold 6 times before we've completed this set of divisions. So another thing you'll notice is that with the grid, I always do everything I can in one set of parallel pleats, then flip the paper over and reverse the new creases. So there's no need to reverse the middle crease because it had already been reversed before. And then I'll flip back to the side that I'm working on and rotate to a different direction. And now I'll do the equivalent folds there. And I'll just put in these little marks on the center line. Go ahead and do that in all the directions. And I'll use my bone folder to get everything nice and smooth. I'm opening that crease before rotating to the opposite side and folding the next copy of that same move. And flip over, and I'll reverse these two new creases and flip back, and I have one more direction to do that division in. And this time I have something new going on. I have a grid intersection out here in the middle of the space. So when I open that fold, I'll go ahead and draw that grid intersection more clearly here. So now when I open, I can take that grid intersection and fold it so that the creases on the top flap line up with the creases down below. And this will put my new fold right through the grid intersection, and it should run my fold to these points where I have the grid lines going through the center, hitting the edge of the paper. Now, no hexagon that you cut out is going to be perfectly precise, and also there's going to be some wiggle room. So if we zoom in really close here, the place where this grid line meets the edge is like a millimeter, millimeter and a half from where this fold reaches that same location. And that's okay, because we are never going to use that intersection as a reference point. And I can open up that intersection. I'll rotate around to the opposite side of the paper where I have that 1/4 fold. And then again, I have that grid intersection, and I really do need to put my head over to see exactly what's going on with that alignment, trying to get these folds on top to line up with the folds underneath. And fold across. This side turned out to be a bit more precise at those points. But like I said, doesn't matter hugely whether that whether this new line coming to the edge of the paper hits precisely at the same point as the line going through the center, because again, you're not really going to use that as a reference. Remember, the least precise points on this hexagon are the corners. The second least precise are the edges. So we always want to fold our grid lines with respect to existing grid creases, which we can now do now that we have enough grid lines to get us started. Before I move to the next round of divisions, the eighths, I want to do that fold in the corner. So where I have the grid lines on top coming and meeting the grid lines down below, I want to do that for the remaining 4 corners. And yes, this is a visibility challenge. One of the things that helps with seeing your grid lines as you're folding is having a low angle light. So all of my light right now is coming from a pretty steep angle. There's the ceiling light behind me, and then there's my my softbox light coming down at a steep angle. The best time for folding for me is when light's coming in from the window in front of me at a pretty shallow angle. So 5, 6 o'clock, that's great time for gridding for me this time of year. And so I want to get those lined up, and like you just saw me do, you can always lift your paper to double check where that fold actually is. So as I do each of these corner folds, I like to bring it over to the edge of my desk to start the fold in the right direction, although I could also do that with 2 hands. I'm reversing each of these creases as I put them in. You could also choose to reverse all of these corner folds after you've folded all of them, but I prefer to just go ahead and do them as I see them. And so now that we have a bunch of grid divisions already, it's pretty straightforward to divide in half again, because we have a space with grid lines on either side, and we can just take that space and divide it in half. If there's a conflict between the grid line going across and the grid line going through the center as to what point they're at, I default to using the grid line that's going through the center, because that is a more primary reference. That's only going to be a problem out here. And another thing that can happen, especially if you're using a softer paper, like this butcher paper that I was folding on, just finished it last night actually. I have 80 grid divisions on the line through the center on this, and towards the edge you'll see, I mean, you probably won't see on this pattern, but if you're folding with softer paper, you'll see that fold comes out towards the edge and then it curls. So when you have these smaller angles, these 30-degree angles at the edge, or even smaller if you're doing other rotated grids, you often run into situations where the paper does not want to fold straight. And it can curl. You've got to be careful that it doesn't rip. And so that is something to keep in mind for precision, that you don't want to reference to where the curl ended up. You want to use a straight segment of that grid. So that's the gridding tips for the even divisions. And again, that's even divisions on the grid lines going through the center. And as I get around to where I would be folding a bigger line onto a shorter line, I'm going to rotate and fold the opposite direction instead. And you'll notice that there's that little bit at the corner that's sticking out past the grid line here. And that's fine. We'll just leave that until the next round of divisions, at which point in time there will be a grid intersection in the middle of that space that we can use as a strong reference for folding that little bit. So again, we want to use the grid intersections, the grid lines, as our references, preferentially over where is the mountain fold on the flap underneath, or where do these folds meet the edge, or where does the corner go. Those are imprecise measurements, but having a grid intersection that you can match the folds on one side of the grid intersection, fold them over onto the other side, that is a very precise reference that will get you grid intersections that stay precise as you add more and more divisions. So that's the even division grid. Let's take a look at the grid with a division of 3. Oh, and one thing before we leave this even division grid, let's count. So they'll count along this direction because we actually do have the eighths there. I always have an integer number of divisions. I'm starting with a grid intersection at the edge and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 divisions as I get across, and those 8 divisions match the half and half and half, 2 times 2 times 2, that I did in order to get this grid. If we were counting from corner to opposite corner, we have like an extra third down here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and another third. So we have 10 and 2/3, which is not 2 times 2 times 2. And so that can be a little bit confusing. The second reason, beyond the math works nicer, that I count along a grid line that goes through the center is that when you're looking at a crease pattern and you're counting the number of divisions from a center point out to where you want to stop, you're counting along a grid line. Along a grid line that goes through the center. You are not counting perpendicular to that grid line, to a corner. And so it makes a lot more sense to plan and decide how many divisions you're going to do based on that grid line that goes through the center, that you then have full control over how many divisions you're actually doing. Where that argument comes apart a little is with the division of 3. So we'll start our grid exactly the same way, with our folds going through the center perpendicular to the edge. I have 3 corners on one side meeting 3 corners on the other side, specifically corner to opposite corner. You can zoom out a bit. And I'm going to go ahead and draw these folds all the way across, because we will need to see the center intersection for this one. And second direction, folding all the way across. Get that a little more solid. And reverse the crease. And third direction, And you'll notice that I'm paying more attention actually to whether these corners and these corners are lined up than to whether those corners are lined up, because if these are, then those have to be, unless your hexagon is really imprecise. And one of the things that I do to get precise hexagons that don't have any folds in them is use an acrylic template like this one. And this is something that you can just lay down on a stack of paper and run a rotary cutter around, and that gets you nice, precise hexagons without any folds, which lets you do all kinds of crazy grids if you don't have existing folds, especially existing folds going through the center. And from here, if we want to do thirds, there's two methods. I should say thirds on these lines. One method that you might be familiar with is bring the corner of the paper into the center intersection. And this will send a grid line out to the existing corners of the paper. I'll go ahead and use my bone folder on that. And then you can open up and rotate around and take the center line and bring it up to that reference line. And if you have a perfect hexagon, then that method is precise. But if you do not have a perfect hexagon, heaven help you, basically. So what can you do to have a more precise method that is also generalizable to if you used a different fraction for starting your grid? If you used these places where the grid line meets the edge of the paper and moved it to a quarter of the way across this edge instead of a half. Well, what you can do is once you have these central grid lines set up, and I like to do this from the opposite side of the paper, you can take, I'm going to mark these places where the folds are hitting the edge. You can take one of these points where the fold hits the edge that went through the center and bring it to the center point and pinch just a little bit. And we're trying to get this pinch in the middle of the grid triangle defined. I can get them all folding at the same time so you can see them, defined by these two grid lines and the center point. So the third edge of that triangle is between these two points where the fold through the center hits the edge. And we're trying to do our pinch towards the middle of that big triangle. And we're going to do the same thing with the other corner that belongs to the same triangle so that we can find the intersection point of these two pinches. And that intersection point is our reference for the division of 3. So back on the side that we're folding our grid lines on, I'm going to mark my intersection point very carefully because I'm drawing on mountain folds. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate my paper so that instead of using the corner of the hexagon, which is the least precise point if you've cut it out yourself, I'm going to use the most precise point, which is an intersection of grid lines. I'm going to use that intersection and bring it to another intersection of folds, again, very precise. And as I fold, I might want to try and make some adjustments for how these corners of the hexagon are lining up with the folds that I'm putting in. But it's going to come out pretty close. There is going to be some room for error because we're only this far apart and we're trying to bring 2 points precisely together and say that that's going to be precisely parallel the whole way across. And with human error, no, it's not. Yes, this is another word for a triangle grid is an isometric grid. I'm seeing in the chat that you asked. And we're specifically dividing this section in 3 pieces. So now that I have this first line, I can rotate, and with the even divisions, I was bringing these points where the center grid lines hit the edge all the way to the center. Now I just want to divide this space in half. So I'm going to bring those 2 points to the place where I just folded, which should fold through that intersection of pinches and should fold out to the corners of the hexagon and should bring this corner of the hexagon in to the center. But the important thing is that these 2 points are hitting the line that I just folded. So when we go and reverse these creases, I did the same thing on both sides of the paper, but only one of those methods is generalizable, and only one of them is relying on the grid intersections instead of the corners of the paper. So from here, what I want to do next is rotate to a new direction in the paper, and I want to have my intersection of pinches above the halfway point. So I can use that same intersection to get the thirds in the other directions of the paper. I don't need any new pinches. And so I'm going to fold up so that, let me mark my points here, so that this point that's on the grid line that runs through the center comes and hits that intersection of pinches, and this grid line running through the center where that hits the edge is going to line up on top of one of our thirds that we already folded. And once those both are happily in place, I can fold all the way across and use the bone folder. So what that did is it said, okay, there's 3 spaces in here and a 4th will get me to that pinch. So I have 4 spaces between this point and this pinch, and therefore I can fold that in half, and now there's 2 spaces left, and I can fold those 2 points where the central grid lines are hitting the edge of the paper and bring them to the fold I just made, and fold through. And then same logic on the opposite side, on the other side of the central grid line, where I can take my 2 points where the grid lines are hitting the edge of the paper, bring them up to 1/3 above the central grid line, line up where my grid lines are hitting above and below, fold through, and then bring those same points 2 grid spacings back, to line up and fold through again. And back again. And I will flip over to reorient all 4 of these new creases. And you might be thinking, well, Madonna, there's this great big space over here that doesn't have any fold in it. We'll get there on the next grid direction. So rotating to the 3rd grid direction for this division of 3, I'm taking those same 2 points on the grid lines going through the center. We're coming up to 1/3 above the center. So the first grid set of grid intersections above the center. And at this point, I have enough grid lines that I have grid intersections at all of these points along the way. So I have intersection, 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 intersection. And so it only takes 2 points to make a line. I have 4. And I'm bringing my points up to match. And I'm also making sure that my grid lines on top are lining up with my grid lines below. This is something that the lighting makes it a little hard to see. But that's the main reference that I'm using, not the fact that this corner happens to come to this grid intersection in here. It does also do that, but that's not the most important thing. And then opening up, I can bring my 2 points again to that fold that I just made. But again, most important is that the grid lines on top are lining up with the grid lines down below. And there's going to be like 4 of them, 2 in each direction. And again, as you're heading out into the corners, you should not expect super high precision. This is going to show you how imprecise the corners are. And the good news is that the corners of the paper are going to look fine when you finish your grid. Actually, this one here has folds out to the corners, and you can maybe see at this level of zoom, I can see that they are not all super precise into the corner, and that's perfectly fine. No one can tell. And so we have the 2 folds that we've been doing in each direction. And then we also have 2 more grid intersections. So now we can take this and say, okay, I've got folds above lining up with folds below, and I'm going to make that fold. So it's these folds lining up and these folds lining up, and to a lesser extent, these and these. But mostly these outer 2 are what you really want to be lining up when you're setting up this fold. And then we'll fold through and rotate and repeat those last 3 steps on the other side of the central grid line. And it's important for precision to take your time and really make sure that these folds are exactly where you want them to be before you lock them in with the bone folder. So the speed that I'm going right now might not be the speed that you can go right now. And that might vary depending on your lighting situation and what paper you're using. Some papers are easier to see the folds than others. And again, with the precision, here I have a little gap between where this fold hits the edge of the paper, the grid line through the center, and where this new fold is coming supposedly to the same point. And there's not really a curl out, and it's coming precisely on the other side, but it's a hexagon that I cut myself. It's not going to be 100% precise on the edge, and that's fine. And so we can open it up and flip over to reverse all of our creases. And so some people would call this grid that we have as a result a 8 division grid, perpendicular grid, because there are 8 divisions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 from point to opposite point. But if you count from side to opposite side through the center, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So is this 8 or is this 6? Depends on how you count. But for me, since I always want to count on the grid line going through the center, this is 6 divisions. And so this is what you need to start your grid for next week's tutorial, which I'll be teaching with a 48 division grid on a hexagon using a diagonal setup, which is this one. So right now I'm going around just like we did with the even divisions and taking all of those other 4 corners that did not have the grid intersections when we were folding the parallel thirds, did not have the grid intersections to put in this fold in the corner. And I'm just going back and putting in that one fold to bring them all up to the same level of folding. Yeah, so I'm seeing in the chat the proportion of the short diagonal to the long diagonal is 3/4. Yeah, that tracks. So if we take that with the even division case, so 8 times 3/4 would be, it would be divided by 3 times 4. 8 divided by 3 times 4 would be 32 thirds, 10 and 2/3. Yes, that maths out. So in order to get from this grid with 6 divisions along the central line to a grid with 48, you're going to need to divide in half 3 more times. So in half from 6 gets you 12, in half again gets you 24, in half again gets you 48. And you'll see next week I'll show up with the grid with these markings on it for our tutorial next week. So again, when we're folding that next set of divisions, out here in the corners, it's going to be a little less precise, but what I try to do is match the point where the central grid line hits the edge to the next grid line whenever I have a choice in the matter. So that's what's going on with this. And there is an option here when you have a corner that's going to be precisely a whole number of divisions, to kind of feel it out and notice, okay, I can match this up. I maybe shouldn't. It's not quite as precisely on top of that previous round, but I can match up these grid lines going through on the corner. And so often when I'm folding these kinds of patterns, when I'm getting to the last like 2 rounds of divisions, I'll often just do that corner while I'm folding the round of like the first set of the 3 directions, the first and second, before I have that grid intersection to really lock it in. But there's lots of options for the order of how you fold your grid. One of the things that I want to point out is that directly folding each grid line in half, like I'm doing right now, may get you into a place where you have a really long, really skinny fold. And so what I typically do instead is take a fold and bring it up 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3 old divisions. So as long as you have an odd number of the old divisions, your new fold will be folding one of them, the middle one, in half. And usually I'm dividing 3 old divisions in half until I reach a certain number of divisions, which for me is around 32 or 48. And then I'll start using 5 old divisions, with the caveat that I still want to be able to see where I'm folding. So you'll notice I turned around when I was heading down into the corner and started folding back the other direction. And again, this little point in the corner, that is going to be a whole division, and I can try and eyeball how those grid lines are lining up, and how much space is left on this fold, this flap underneath, that needs to be the same size. But again, there's going to be some imprecision in the corner. Doing that right away before I have really good references is going to decrease my precision. But since this is destined to be a teaching grid and not an art piece, use your own discretion about how precise it really needs to be. So that's what's going on with the gridding. And that is all I wanted to share about diagonal grids. So yeah, keep in mind, you will need a 48 fold, 48 division along that center line. Anytime I say numbers about divisions of grids, it's along the center line. You'll need a 48 division diagonal grid on a hexagon for next week's tutorial. And I've done a couple tutorials in the last couple months that start from a diagonal grid. So I'll make sure to go and post, well, actually I'll share links to a couple of those in this video description, and I'll post a link to this video in those videos descriptions. But if you want a deeper dive into gridding as a whole, make sure to check out Tessellation Foundations, which also comes with a bunch of nice pattern tutorials including one that uses a diagonal grid to full effect. So happy folding, everyone, and see you in the next video.